Well, thank you for that introduction, and what a pleasure it is to be speaking with you, Mala, at any given point in time. And thank you to all of you who've showed up here. It's a very early morning, but it's a nice day and it'll be a nice conversation. So hopefully it's going to be worth your time. Mala, I'm going to start by asking you. I was half balking at the introduction that she was reading for you, and half thinking it's utterly inadequate. You've led an impossibly rich and diverse life. Theatre, cinema, publishing, editing, cultural diplomacy, conservation, museums, textiles, journalism, history, politics, you name it, all of these things thread through your life, all right? And exactly, and that's very, very hard to achieve. And of course, writing, which, is why we're here. The question I wanted to ask, Mala, is that you've not led a conventional life. And that's not easy at the best of times, but perhaps not easy for your generation either. I wanted to ask where that came from. This way of living life where you did not believe in silos, this way of living life where you thought everything is a part of something else. Where did that come from?
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for being here. I grew up in a rather unusual home. My parents were young lefties post-independence. It was a heady period in India. There was this dream to build a wonderful new country. And we had all manner of people walking in and out of the house. And as a young girl, I was very ill at one point. I had a bout of polio, and was flat out in bed. And my parents used to be part of IPTA. So every evening there'd be, for instance, rehearsals in the living room of the house. And my bed would be wheeled to the door. And within 1 week, I'd become the prompter, because as a young child, you memorize much easier than you do when you're older. And that, I think, linked me immediately with theater. And I'll come to that. And then, because they were young lefties, there was always somebody from the CID, it used to be called in those days, who sat outside the flat peering in to see who was coming and who was going. And that intrigued me as a young child, wondering, who is this man and why does he want to know about the innards of our life? And that got me interested in the political space, I think. So these two came together, and theatre, Pragya, really shows you what the world has to offer. Everything is encompassed, from fashion to what people wore, to period, space, and time. And I think that was the fundamental. My parents never expected anything of me. They said, just experience life as it happens. When we were young, we sat with our parents in the evening. We listened to conversations through the day. Parents worked from the house. So it was life in process, as it were. And I just felt from a very early age I want to experiment everything. So when I was thrown out of university for being errant and not attending PT classes, I went and joined the National School of Drama and graduated as a director. And now you'll have to pull me back, otherwise I'll keep on talking.
Well, you know how it is. I can keep on listening to you. But, you talked about the fact that the world, I mean, your parents' home was your crucible, and then the world was your learning school. You left university, you went to NSD, but all of these other things that you did, theatre you had professional education in, but publishing also came to you from your parents. So you were picking up things, you were learning as you went along.
So if I go back to the 50s in Bombay, Bombay was the hub of all kinds of cultural activity. And because India had just become independent, you had all kinds of interesting professionals who came to Bombay. They wanted to connect with this new country. So you had Roberto Rossellini came to make a film for Nehru on India after he'd made a successful film called Rome, an Open City. He came to India and Nehru asked him to make a film. Corbusier came to build Chandigarh. You had people like Dilip Kumar and Sardar Jafri and poets, writers, playwrights, the Jerson Dakunas, the Alkazis, as young people, in and out of the house. And I think that very whole experience of all professions, from politics to economics to theater to music, was so much part of my DNA that I didn't have another option. I couldn't fall into a silo. It was not possible. I had to break loose. And I think it also has to do with our generation. We were, I don't know whether the word is correct because, these days there are all kinds of jargon and it can be misinterpreted. But we took risks. We just did what we wanted. And I was fortunate to have parents who said, just go, jump into the deep end. Then we moved to Delhi.
This is what I wanted to come to because you spoke about 50s in Bombay. Your life has been, mirrored in the life of the country. It was you were young when the country was young. And I wonder what it was like to be young in the early days of the country, in the heart of the country, which was Delhi. You were telling me, I think yesterday, that in those days there were about 100 or 200 people. You knew each other. You were all feeding off one another, learning and influencing one another. What was the jazba really like of being young in that moment?
Well, for me, coming from Bombay, it was a culture shock. Everyone was wearing salwar kameez, all the girls. We were wearing short skirts coming from Bombay. Everyone looked at me rather strangely. And in fact, when I went to modern school and, we had to be selected for a house, I remember Shekhar Kapoor saying, I'll take that one. Because I was in a skirt and not in a salwar kameez, and I was sort of swinging my pigtail. And, we were emancipated in that sense coming from Bombay. Delhi was very, very conservative. And strangely, I've mentioned Shekhar. It is he who, many, many decades later, asked me to act in Masoom. Because he had a very small budget, and he walked into my office and he said, I need someone who looks very Punjaban and very fat and not particularly good looking, and will you do the role? And I said, well, I'll fix you, I'll do the role. And I did the role. So it was, Delhi was quiet. Everyone went to sleep with All India Radio News at 9 o'clock. Ye hai Akashvani, whatever it was. The roads were quiet. Hyenas and jackals roamed the street, particularly where we lived near the Ridge, which was a new colony coming up. And, it was tough. When I went to learn how to play tennis at the Gymkhana Club and I was wearing shorts, people would ring up my mother and say, you can't have your daughter look like that. She should be wearing salwar kameez. So from that, you had Indira Gandhi come to power. And I think the whole thing began to change because she was a young woman. She was 58, a widow, becoming Prime Minister of India, unheard of in those days. And with her came, and I'm cutting a lot out, with her came the Pupul Jaikars, Padmaja Naidu. These were all my mentors, Prem Berry, Sina Kaul. These women were given jobs to do. First by Nehru, in the 50s, but I was in Bombay. And then when I came to Delhi, those projects that they were given had matured. And I was in my early teens, but they roped you in. At 14, 15, a Pupul Jaikar would sit with me and talk to me about handlooms. From the age of 16, I wore saris. I wore cotton saris. And I remember people in college saying to me in Miranda House, the 1 year I was there, why do you dress like an ayah? Because in those days it wasn't maid or help, it was the ayah. And I used to find that very strange. Cut. Festival of India happened, those same women were buying the saris that were ayah saris.
We will come to Ayah Saris and Festival of India in a moment, but I want to introduce the book at this point in time. We started this conversation talking about what a rich and varied life you've had. And I can't possibly imagine the challenge of someone like you sitting down to write their memoir in one piece. So I feel like this is a very interesting form to tell your story. Using saris as not just a metaphor for your life, but also as marker of time and place in your life. This book is, like you, genre-defying. It is part cultural history, it is part memoir, part ode to and tribute to people and places in memory. What made you think of this book? What made you conceive this? What do you remember the first time you were like, this is something I want to do?
Well, I was in Rome driving in a bus to a place called Zagarolo and for a little conference with a lot of our friends, because somebody had said to me, the organizer, can you bring the best and brightest of India to Italy? And I said, well, how many people? And gave me a number. So I picked all my friends, Subodh and Bharti and Shekhar Kapoor and people like that, you know. And we went off, and there was Avik Sen, an art historian, sitting with me in the bus, and we were talking about, he said, you know, you must write down all this. I said, but it's so, you know, I'm a professional dilettante. I'm not a professional in one field. And he said, you know, Mala, why don't you just do 4 or 5 volumes and break up your life? So that stuck. And because I'm obsessed with saris or textiles, I decided to write that story. The Pupul Jayakar, the Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay, the stories of skill and weaving, which I believe is the story of India. And when I got involved in it, I feel comfortable only in a sari. I feel very tied up and constricted when I'm wearing anything else. And I just decided, you know, I have to tell that story to another generation, or more so to my grandchildren. You know, I'm not a book launcher in that sense. But I need to tell the story because, as you said, it's unusual. We were very lucky to live at a time where we met great minds. They were, you know, you weren't social climbing. There were a lot of interesting people that came in and out of our lives who had reached the pinnacle of their careers. And we didn't feel awkward meeting a Rossellini or a Sonali or a Krishna Ribu or a Padmaja Naidu because they embraced the young. They mentored us in a very natural way. You know, they told us stories. And I think that's where the storytelling element comes in, where I thought if I use the sari, as you said, as a marker, I can tell anecdotal stories of a period in time for my grandchildren who will be able to, you know, just relish a time that they're not going to see.
Well, thanks to your grandchildren, Suru, the rest of us get to hold on to this just absolutely wondrous slice of history. But I want to stay for a minute with the sari itself. Actually, perhaps, you know, what I can do is I can read the first paragraph of your book. We've been talking about the book in abstract. I don't know how many of you have had the chance to actually go through the book. It is available online, and it is available in bookstores. But I'm just going to read out a little bit from the book, if that's all right with you. Yeah. This is the opening paragraph. If I have a magnificent obsession, it is the sari. From when I was very young and up until now, I cannot resist admiring, possessing, and wrapping saris around myself with sheer joy. The unstitched length of cloth that defines the Indian feminine sartorial style is a physical repository of design aesthetics, color palettes, and myriad motifs. Color and ornamentation create visual vocabularies and pictorial conversations that are immediately recognizable, sharing stories of exchanges and influences that came to our shores over vast swaths of time. So, you know, this is something I want to pick up on, but I want to quickly read another small bit. And the reason I've chosen these 2 bits to read is to give you the sort of expanse of the book. In this first paragraph, Mala sets up both the personal and the cultural history elements of this book. She talks about the significance of sari as a leitmotif of the civilization of India, but she also talks about her own magnificent obsession with them. And then she comes to what is deeply personal every now and then. And this is a paragraph that these are 2 paragraphs that she writes about her mother. 2 types of saris defined my mother, Raj, and her life in Bombay, a city she loved and shared a skin with. In those days, she only wore handloom and khadi, hand-spun yarn and hand-woven saris with thin-edged borders, simple textured cottons. She occasionally wore a Parsi gara or an embellished georgette. She did not wear elaborate jewelry but sported diamond solitaires in her ears and a solitaire on her engagement finger. My parents' home was an anchor for the young intellectuals that peopled the city in the 50s and a comfortable haven for those who visited Bombay from across India and the world. Artists, actors, painters, writers, poets, filmmakers, philosophers, business people, political activists, bureaucrats, and also the rudderless in search of a mentor of all ages and nationalities would congregate at their flat on Malabar Hill. A continuous flow of people and ideas, discussion, argument, and debate molded all our lives. Their friends were ours, and many have remained so till today. In 1961, when our nuclear family moved to Delhi, my mother was bereft, friendless, and isolated. Transiting from the freedom of living life with abandon to a space she had to contend with in laws and a joint family was a tough adjustment, even though we lived in a separate part of the larger family home. To stay connected with Bombay, she had brought a branch severed from the frangipani tree outside our home in Mayfair on Malabar Hill to transplant in the front garden of her new home at 19 Kautilya Marg. For her, it was a perennial reminder of the happiest years of the first phase of her life, the profusion of flowers marking endless entrenched memories. That once upon a time small branch has over the decades grown and flowered into a tree that scales 3 floors of the building we live in, its canopy shading the ashes of my parents buried beneath it alongside its spreading roots. It is where they had instructed they wanted their ashes to go, and that is where they live on, their presence alive, their memory sharp and defined.
I think you all just need to read the book instead of listening to it.
No, so I find it fascinating that you've managed to use the sari to talk about your whole life, your mother, your early years, and your marriage, and your work, and so on. But Mala, if we zoom out, the sari in many ways can also tell the story of this Indic civilization, this great civilization of ours. The country is still young, but the civilization is ancient. And, the sari, in the way of India, has been gathering influences layer upon layer as people came in, cultures came in, and has assimilated all of them quite like India. Would you like to talk a little about that?
Yeah, yes, it's very interesting. Let me start with Mohenjo-daro and Ajrak. We assume that. Now, I'm one of those people who really don't look too much to empirical evidence, more storytelling. And I believe that the story of Ajrak started in Mohenjo-daro because on the bust of the priest, you see the pattern that is now in Ajrak. They used color, blue and madder, earth and sky. Motifs were drawn from nature and from the universe. I mean, from the sky, stars, moon, half moon, waning, waxing moon. From there, it moved into India. It came down into Rajasthan, went into Gujarat, and Ajrak became, I think, a signature for us in terms of color, motif, and textile. You had ikat coming from Southeast Asia. I believe it came from Southeast Asia to India and then was traded. So trade. Textile trade carried stories of history, time, and age. And over time, for instance, you had, let me cut to modernism. You had modernism, Art Deco happening in the West. You saw motif of that on the looms in Banaras. And in my book, there is a textile which has a traditional shikarga, which is from Banaras, which is a tiger attacking a deer. And it's a recurring motif that runs through the textile, in this particular case in the border. And you have Art Deco sunbursts as the recurring motif on the body of the sari. Very clearly, that is 1904. It's an influence from the West. You had Maharanis wearing chiffon saris because chiffon and French chiffon, and it was very popular at a certain time. But because they were wearing saris and they were from India, they attached brocade borders to the chiffon saris. Now, these are all stories that I've made up in my own mind about how and why these things happened. Because I'm neither a historian nor an academic. I just like to experience what I see, talk to people, garner information, and then create my own stories.
You know, it's also fascinating. If you look at the traditional dress in most countries, it's become redundant. It's become a sort of stilted signifier of another time and a costume of sorts. So you'll be able to go to any number of countries where there'll be a photo booth and you can put on their traditional garment and get a photograph taken. And that is all that remains of it in their day-to-day life. But for us, the sari being our most ancient garment still abides. I'm not wearing this sari. Mala is not wearing this sari because we're talking about saris. We wear saris to have lunch with one another. We wear saris. I was wearing a sari, been wearing a sari 3 days of this festival. All of us still continue to wear the sari. And I wonder, Mala, you know, so many of our traditions have fallen by the wayside, but this is abided. What do you think makes for the sari's longevity?
You know, I believe the unstitched length of cloth doesn't fit into any style, fashion, or mode, age, or time. It's woven, it's worn. Maharashtra, they wear 9 yards. In other parts of the country, they wear shorter saris. Why 9 yards? Because they need, you know, fisher folk, paddy fields. Women out there can't wet the sari. You need 9 yards. You take it between your legs. You tuck it up. It's very versatile. It survives. The unstitched cloth, the turban, India, everyone wears a turban. In rural India, they all wear turbans because it's very hot. You know, for 9 months of the year, you have to cover your head. They tie turbans differently, and it's all unstitched. The Angavastra is unstitched. They survive because they're not fitting into any special fad. And I think that will keep it going because it makes it very versatile. I mean, let's look at today. You could have young women wearing a pair of jeans and a t-shirt and buying a sari and wrapping it any which way around them, just to embellish their body with a drape. And I think the drape is critical. It's very feminine, it's very masculine, it's very everything. And I think that is its survival, that men, women can wear it, drape it any which way. There's no rule. You don't have to wear a short skirt because it's the fashion. You don't have to wear a midi because it's a fashion. You do it as you choose. You, the individual, is the fashionista. That's what's nice. It makes for diversity. It makes for pluralism. It makes for all the things that India is. And I think you were asking me a question about the socio-political and how I link the sari with it. It represents all that. It's your thing. You do it your way. It's not something that's dictated to you, that you must wear it like this. No, you can do what you like with it because it is unstitched.
You know, Mala, you were talking about being 16 years old and wearing cotton saris, aya saris. You've also seen that sari transform over your lifetime, you know, and I think perhaps one of the big catalysts was the coming of the power loom and the sort of prints that came with it. Could you talk a little bit about how the sari has remained the same but also changed in many ways in terms of how women wear it and use it?
So, at independence, Panditji strangely told his finance minister, T.T. Krishnamachari, that, you know, find people who will go and revive the handloom tradition and the skill sector. So I'm putting it very, very simplistically. There was Pupul Jaikar handlooms, Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay, who dealt with the craft tradition. And they went around, Pupul said to me, and it's a very interesting story. She said to me, there was I, you know, playing cards at the Willingdon Club, and suddenly I was told, you know, why don't you look at the handloom sector? And she said, I didn't know what a loom was. So she was told, just go find out. So she traveled around the country and taught herself. Cut. She made us do the same thing. I mean, I'm just weaving all this together because that's how it happened. And I think that was the continuation of the interest. But saris, suddenly you found that hand spun and hand woven cotton and khadi was too expensive for clothing India. The Palum came in because it was cheaper and you just needed 2 saris you could wash and wear for working women, blah, blah, blah. And that's all in the book, so you better buy the book and read it. Dhirubhai Ambani started the man-made fiber sari that really made an impact, Vimal. And he started by putting a lot of floral prints, thinking that he'd go the French chiffon way. But because he was addressing a middle-class working woman, she was awkward wearing the floral, strangely. That was very elitist. So he had to introduce traditional prints into the Vimal sari. So you had an ikat border and an ikat palla. There had to be a palla and a border. It couldn't be just a seamless length of cloth with flowers on it. The floral prints had to be Indian, sanganer, bagru, not some Western interpretation of a chrysanthemum or a Chinese interpretation of a chrysanthemum. By the way, Chinese chrysanthemums also entered the Banaras looms through the trade route.
And you show a beautiful tancho.
Yes, there's a tancho in my book on that. So, Paloom became very popular, but with Indian motif. And they had to change the color palette also because women wanted to wear haldi, they wanted to wear reds, they wanted to wear bangani, pyazi. They didn't want to have mauve, lilac. That wasn't our color palette. So they adjusted. Dhirubhai adjusted to all that as well. I'm going to cut to now. What is interesting now is that a lot of young people who were born well after independence didn't see this growth pattern, have suddenly got very interested in organic cotton, in handloom saris, in the hand skills. And I think there is a generation in their 20s and 30s and 40s who are going back to weaving communities, intervening with color and maybe some pattern, and reviving saris again, reviving textiles again. And they're not carrying the baggage of you must do it because now we become independent, we must go back to what it was before the Brits took the cotton out. I mean, I'm putting it very simplistically. But they're doing it genuinely because there's a sense of pride that's come. And I think it's a cycle. And the cycle has begun again of revival. I don't even want to call it revival. It's more a resurrection.
Yeah. You know, Mala, you touched upon Popul Jaikar a couple of times. So I just want to also talk to you about, so you were acquainted with the sari. In the book, you write about the first piece of sari that was given to you. You were wearing saris when you were 16. But when you grow up, you become a serious collector of saris. And I find it interesting that the people and the events that have shaped your life have also shaped your understanding of the rich heritage of the sari. Could you talk a little, and perhaps Festivals of India is a key milestone there. Could you talk a little bit about that?
So there again, the Popul Jaikars of the world, and I'm going to use her as a metaphor. Festivals of India, Mrs. Gandhi decided she wanted to showcase India overseas. The liberal intelligentsia damned it, said unnecessary expense of money, you know, not enough water, there's not enough this, that. But they went ahead with it, and it really was a turning point. Martin Singh was asked by Popul Jaikar. Now he's not a technical weaver or anything. He hasn't been to NID, he hasn't learnt the ropes. But he was a great impresario, and his aesthetic was very fine. So Martin Singh and Rakesh Thakur, who trained in textile design, came together and they created something called Vishwakarma, where they went around the entire country and picked up weaving traditions from every state to showcase them for India and for the world. And I'm saying that very consciously because with that start, the weaving communities across India realized that there was a potential market within the country that would keep them going through their life and hopefully get their children to understand the loom as well. Because the looms are really the computers. In, they are the IT of India. They're in the heads of people. You don't have an app. It's in your head. You pass it down. The jacquard loom. I mean, we have these traditions. They're inbuilt in our DNA. And I think that we are tending to forget all this. However, there is a new generation of youngsters who are going back to those information technologies of India that are very much the creative base today of the planet. I mean, it's only the subcontinent that has it left. Everyone else has got into silos. We, luckily, are not fully in silos yet.
I count you as the young generation of India. And I want to move away. If you have time, I'll come to your collection again because.
Collection, let me just tell you very quickly.
Sure.
I didn't consciously collect. Every time I saw a sari that I really liked, I just went and bought it. And in our time, I gave myself a top limit. Nothing more in the first years of my life more than 2,000 rupees. Thereafter, nothing more than 5,000 rupees. And today, nothing more than 10,000 rupees. Now, if you can stay within that range and not go to some fancy store where the markup is about 7 times what the weaver's getting, and buy, and you know, I just don't buy anything at 60,000 rupees. It's absurd. When I can go straight to the weaver. Given the money, no middleman, you cut it out. And their Instagram has played a great role. Because weavers are all on Instagram now, and they're selling directly.
I love that Mala points to me when she says Instagram. But, you know, one of the things is that the reason why I think this book is so valuable is that someone like myself who's loved saris, grown up around saris in Calcutta, my own conscious collection of saris has been greatly influenced by Mala. And now many more generations can read this book and find the vocabulary of saris and start their own collections as well. It doesn't have to be confined to the few of us who've had the privilege of getting to know Mala personally. But Mala, beyond your collection, you've also been a revivalist, or whatever you want to call it, a resurrector, a revivalist of saris. You've taken on some very key projects when it comes to the revival of saris. Could you talk a little bit about how some of these came to be? Perhaps starting with Reva.
Oh, I forgot about Reva, yes. Reva, years ago, Richard Holker and Shalini Devi, Sally, we'd met them at a dinner, and the next morning they came over and they said, let's start Reva Society. And we went off to Maheshwar, and Leela Mulgaonkar, who gave me my first sari when I was 8, actually was heading something that could fund the looms we wanted to put in. So she gave the first transfer of money. You know, look at the circle. All these little connections that keep coming back in life. And we started Reva Society. I'm not going to get into that too much because there's not enough time. But Reva Society started with 10 looms. And now we have 300 looms. And we started a scheme called Adopt a Loom in those days, which is what? Nearly 50 years ago, 48 years ago. And we got another 20 looms by getting 20 women to adopt a loom. If you could adopt a child, you can adopt a loom. And today, the village has got 3,000 looms, and economically, they sustain, each loom sustains a family of 5. So I think that's a great success story. We also then started, we got interest-free loans for the women weavers to buy homes, and they became the karta dharta of the house. That helped. We started a creche for their children, and the whole thing has taken off. A school, a weaving school, then Sally started Women Weaves. So that's now got a life of its own. Cut from there, I started something called, I had a very bad moment in 2000 when I left a job that I was doing with a television station and a publishing empire. And I started something called Saris of Memory, from which this title of the book has come. I went back to Reva and I did a Ahilya Bai collection. reviving some of the older saris and putting them out in the market at exhibitions. Then I did the Indira Gandhi collection to celebrate her 100th birth anniversary by taking 7 of her cotton saris that she used when she was electioneering and 7 Banarsi saris from her collection and put them back on the looms with a new color palette. So, you know, went back to using colors from nature. The color of the onion, the color of the brinjal, the color of the neem tree, a neem leaf, and so on. So that was the Indira Gandhi collection, did very well. Then I found the man who printed the saris in the 1950s for cottage industries. His father had done them. We found all the blocks and we reprinted them and celebrated Prem Berry, who set up cottage industries. Then what did and then I did my own. I remembered Venkat Giri saris as being very simple, geometric, white or natural and gold. And saw a woman called Prema Srinivasan wearing one. It was in my memory. I drew it out, gave it to Ahilya Martin, who said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I'd like to revive the Venkat Giri as it used to be." And we did 9 designs. They're selling like hotcakes. We haven't fiddled around. But the nice thing was that one of the young weavers said to me, he said, "You know, ma'am, this sari is just like what my father used to weave. And we've forgotten how to do it and you brought it back." So that made me feel very good. So that we did. Then during COVID, my daughter-in-law said to me, "Why don't you create 21 great textiles sitting at home talking to the weavers you know on the phone, on the mobile phone?" So I said, okay, and we did it.
We have very little time, but I'd also like to add one thing to it, Mala, which is that not only have you done, you've revived many different kinds of weaves and prints, you've also mentored revivalists. You just mentioned Ahilya Mathan. I'm sure she'd be very pleased to be called your mentee. And the sari, in fact, I'm wearing is from Registry of Saris that she's set up, greatly inspired by you. And it's a Hosa Ramba. And she's also now reviving a lot of old techniques, old weaves, and making them available. So just wanted to give her a shout out as well. But before we close, we'll take a couple of questions from the audience. I think there's no greater pleasure. Hang on, you'll have to bear with me for one more minute. There's no greater pleasure in life than to sit down with Mala and have her take you through some saris of hers. When she's feeling generous, and she'll open her cupboard or she'll open her suitcase and she'll start showing you some of the textiles that she owns. There's no greater pleasure. And I wanted to share that pleasure with all of you today. So we've got some of the saris from her personal collection on a PPT, and we're going to have her take you through them, introduce you to those saris. That's the PPT. I'll have to give someone a cue to, could be perfect.
Okay. That's a very interesting sari. It's an ajrak on one side and a tie-dye on the other, and it's all in one sari. And there's a story to that. That sari, there was a very fine man called Brij Bhasin who actually retired in Jaipur. And he was very, very ill. And a friend went to visit him and he said, "I don't know whether I'm going to live very long. And when you go to Delhi, will you take this sari for Mala? Because it represents the resist technique of holding color and of 2 kinds. Tie-dye from Rajasthan and ajrak, which also came to Rajasthan. And so this sari is very, very special, and it combines the earth, the sky, traditional motifs, and the start of Indian textiles for me.
Could we have 1 or 2 more images, please?
That's another ajrak done today, which is really very fine, and it's done on very, very fine 120 count cotton.
You'll have to keep going through here.
This is a kalamkari. I selected this to show because it's hand painted. It's a recurring motif, and it is done by hand through the imagination of the artist. The artist in India, the weaver in India, the painter in India was the designer. There was no other breed. They did it. It came from their imagination, the color palette, the motif, the way they wanted to do it. So that is the previous one that's just passed. That is from Kalamkari. That is a Kalamkari sari without all the color. It's just a duotone. This is also hand painted. Now this is very interesting. It is hand painted, and you don't see the division or the stroke of the brush. It's in black, and here's the story too. Issei Miyake came to India, and he saw this technique, didn't believe that the color would be fast, the black, sent it abroad for testing, ended up using it for his first fashion show. He made a skirt using this kind of painted fabric on the ramp in Paris. That I tried to do during COVID. I asked the weavers in Banaras to go back to weaving saris for me in cotton and not in silk. It's easy to weave silk, not easy to weave cotton. And I took a jali from Mughal India and just said to them, here's a picture. I sent it on WhatsApp. I said, can you please do the framework for this and weave me a sari in cotton? And they wove this sari in cotton, silver and black. This is a very interesting textile sari. Each of these squares are patterns from Kanjivaram. And this was woven by Malvika Singh for the Festival of India. And I'm very privileged to have this sari.
Well, that's all we have time for. There's a lot more that you'll have to read in the book, buy it. She'll be signing copies later, but now I think we have time for one or two questions. We had a lady here, and then we'll come to you. She was asking a question.
Good morning, ma'am. Congratulations on the book. As someone who has Sari as not only as main character in the book, but in her life as well, I want to ask, have you noticed any predictable pattern amongst generations of advent of handloom, or is it unpredictable? Will there always be a generation that would willing to resurrect it always in India?
You know, that's for your generation to decide, not for me. All I want to say is, as long as we don't fall into the trap of wearing zipped up saris, because there are a lot of women who want to wear a sari when they go abroad to feel Indian, that is false. Either you learn to wrap it any which way you want. The moment you zip yourself up in a sari, that's the end of the sari. So I'm just hoping all of you will wear saris and not lehengas when you get married.
There's a question up front, and then there.
Hello, Mala. Thank you very much indeed for an incredible conversation. A thought experiment. Imagine 1,000 years hence, someone stumbles across your sari collection, and that someone is an archaeologist, and they find your collection. Which is the one sari you hope they find, and why? What is the story it would tell about you, society, India, whatever?
Actually, strangely, I think it would be a sari called the Bomkai, which was revived in Orissa during the Festival of India, because for me, its colors, the palette, the motif are primordial and therefore very contemporary. And that's the passage of time. It all remains the same with a little bit of interpretation.
You've always said that you have beautiful conversations with the saris, and you did discuss. One story or the conversation which you didn't want to have with any of your saris. The idea is to tell that sometimes people make mistakes in life, and saris do appreciate and tell that.
Actually, I've never bought any sari that I've not liked or not wanted to treat as my second skin. So forget the stories. I think every sari that I have bought and worn. Oh, okay. All right, I'll tell you one story. There was one sari I bought that was a little chatak. You know, the colors were a little odd. So I didn't know what to do with it, and the motif was lovely, and the border was very beautifully woven, very fine. So I put some tea leaves into a bucket of water, then strained the tea leaves and chucked the sari into it, into the chai, okay, without milk and sugar, and pulled it out, and all the colors had got muted. So that sari is one of the saris of transformation, which I've kept. I've never given away that sari. And the second one I did was this very chatak saris that they make now, which are called, what are they called? Forgotten, having a senior moment. Paitanis, silk paitanis, with bright colors and peacocks and trees and leaves. As I can't wear this is ridiculous, so I put it into black dye. The gold came out, and then here's the last story. I walk into a room and Martin Singh is sitting there, and he looks at me and says, "Oh, where did you get that, darling?" So I said, "Oh, it belonged to my great-grandmother." And he was none the wiser. It was just dyed in Punjab dyers in Delhi a week earlier.
I think we have time for one last question. Yes?
Yeah, Mala, as always, interesting. How do you see the power loom versus handloom, and looking at the state of our country where the affordability is in the power loom, how do you see the revival of the weavers, because it's their career and their income?
Good question. We thought about that a lot during Vishwakarma, and I have to give Martin Singh his due here. He said the only way that the weavers in India will carry on weaving great textiles is if we make it a patronage art and craft. So you have to pay. There will be people who will buy it, buy great textiles, and you make it a patronage art, you throw it out of kilter. You don't service a working middle class. Let the power loom do that. Even khadi. You cannot use khadi. I mean, everyone thinks khadi is a cheap cloth. It isn't. It's very expensive. So you can't clothe India with khadi. So the power loom does that. It's okay. Times change. To keep the textile skill, the computers in the head going, you make it a patronage craft and you pay for it. People have to pay for it.
That's all we have time for. There's never enough time with Mala, but hopefully the conversation will continue when you read the book. Thank you.